Part 1. The woman in the longhouse. The fire has been out for 3 hours. Astrid Eriksdottir knows this because she was awake when the last ember died. She is lying on the sleeping platform in the longhouse she has shared with her husband and 3 children for 11 years, and she is listening not to the wind, not to the sea. She has lived beside the sea her entire life. The sea is not what she is listening to. She is listening to the silence where her husband's breathing should be. The year is 866. The settlement is on the eastern coast of what will one day be called England. But that name does not exist yet. This is Northumbria. This is Anglo-Saxon territory. And for the past 4 years, Astrid's family has been part of a Norse settlement that pushed into this territory with the same force of necessity and ambition that drives all migrations to many people. Not enough land, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the horizon there was more. There was more. They found it. They built here. And now it is the 43rd night since the raid warning. And her husband went to the southern wall 3 weeks ago and did not come back. And last night she heard something on the road that the sentries had not heard. And now the fire's out and the silence is wrong. She hears it before she understands what she is hearing. Not a sound, an absence of sound. The goats have stopped moving. The dog has stopped breathing. And in the space where normal night noise should be, there is a particular quality of silence that Astrid has never heard before, but that her body understands immediately, completely, in the way that the body understands things that the mind has not yet processed. Someone is outside the door, more than one person, not moving, waiting. What happens in the next 4 minutes will take Astrid 11 years to fully describe, not because she cannot remember. She will remember every detail with a precision that will never fade, will remember it in the moment she is dying 40 years later in a place she never expected to be, in circumstances she could not have imagined on this night, in a life that will be so different from the life she is living right now that the woman she is about to become will sometimes struggle to believe she was ever this woman, asleep in a longhouse with a fire that has gone out, listening to silence that is wrong. What happens in those 4 minutes is the beginning of what I am going to tell you tonight, and I need to warn you before we go any further. What happened to Astrid Eriksdottir, what happened to the Norse women captured by Anglo-Saxon raiders during the conflicts of the 9th and 10th centuries is not a story that appears in the histories you were taught. It does not appear in the Viking sagas, which were written by Norsemen who had reasons to tell certain stories and not others. It does not appear in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, which were written by monks who had different reasons to tell different stories and not others. It appears in the documents that neither side wanted to preserve, in the legal codes that described practices without naming them, in the church records that documented consequences without acknowledging causes, in the archaeological evidence that tells stories that neither culture's written sources would admit to. I have spent months with these sources. What they reveal about what happened to Norse women in Anglo-Saxon captivity is documented, specific, and almost completely absent from everything you have ever been taught about the Viking Age. Subscribe right now if you want history from the sources rather than the textbooks, because the door of Astrid's longhouse is about to come off its hinges, and I am going to tell you exactly what happens next. But first, you need to understand something that almost no one who tells you about this period understands. You need to understand who the Anglo-Saxons actually were in 866. Part 2. The world before the door comes down. You have been taught the Viking Age backwards. That is not a small mistake. It is the mistake that makes everything else about this period incomprehensible. The mistake that transforms a complex, documented history of mutual raiding, cultural exchange, and systematic violence into a simple story of savage Norsemen terrorizing innocent Christians. Here is what the traditional account leaves out. The Anglo-Saxons were not peaceful farmers who had never seen violence before the Norse arrived. They were the descendants of Germanic invaders who had themselves pushed into Britain several centuries earlier, displacing and subjugating the Romano-British population with a thoroughness that later historians would use as a definition of conquest. They practiced raiding. They practiced taking. They had specific legal codes governing the treatment of captives and the conditions under which free people could be reduced to unfreedom. These codes were not responses to the Norse arrival. They predated it by generations. The Dooms of King written in Wessex around 690, nearly 2 centuries before the period we are discussing, contains specific provisions about the treatment of Welsh captives, Welsh meaning, in this context, anyone who was not Anglo-Saxon, that describe a system of captivity with rules, categories, and procedures. By 866, this system had been operating for over 100 years. The Norse settlers in Northumbria arrived into a world that already had a fully developed framework for dealing with people it categorized as outsiders, a framework with legal standing, a framework with institutional support, a framework with specific procedures for processing people who fell into it. When the door of Astrid's longhouse came down, she did not fall into chaos. She fell into a system. And that system is what tonight's video is actually about. Part 3. The door. It comes off the top hinge first. This is consistent with how Anglo-Saxon raiders breached doors and settlements. They had surveilled and they had surveilled this one. You need to understand that they knew the layout of this longhouse, knew the number of people inside, had spent at minimum several hours in the darkness outside making the calculations that preceded any organized raid. The door comes off the top hinge, swings inward, hangs for one suspended second at a diagonal, and Astrid is already off the sleeping platform, already moving toward the children, already doing the thing that mothers do in moments of crisis before conscious thought has time to participate. She does not reach the children. The sources that document Anglo-Saxon raiding methodology, and I want to be precise here because I know that sounds abstract in this moment, but the methodology is exactly why Astrid does not reach her children. Describe a specific entry, technique for occupied structures in Norse settlements that was developed. Prevent organized resistance in the seconds after breach. Multiple raiders entered simultaneously through all available openings, not just the door, the window slit on the east wall, the smoke hole in the roof. Every point of entry exploited at the same moment, with the specific goal of preventing any occupant from reaching any other occupant before control was established. Control was established in the longhouse of Astrid Eiriksdottir in approximately 40 seconds. She is on the floor. Her wrists are being bound with a kind of efficiency that comes from having done this before. She can hear her children, she cannot see them. She can tell from the sound she can hear that they are also on the floor, also being processed by the same efficiency. What she cannot tell yet, what she will not know for several minutes, that will feel. She will later say, like several years, is which category of the raid's outcome her children are going to fall into. I am going to tell you what categories those were, but first I need to tell you something about what was happening outside the longhouse at this exact moment. Because what was happening outside is what determined everything that happened after. Part 4. What history forgot to write down. In the year 866, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria was engaged in what its own chronicles described as a campaign of territorial consolidation in the eastern coastal regions where Norse settlers had established communities over the preceding decades. Territorial consolidation. That is the phrase the Anglo-Saxon chronicles use. It is a phrase that describes a military operation without describing what military operations actually involved for the people on the receiving end of them. It describes movement of armies and establishment of control without describing what happened in longhouses and coastal settlements when that control was being established. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles were written by monks who served the same kings whose armies were conducting these territorial consolidations. You will understand why, given that context. The chronicles contain extensive descriptions of Viking raids on Anglo-Saxon monasteries and towns, and rather fewer descriptions of what Anglo-Saxon forces did to Norse settlements. The Norse sagas, written centuries later, describe Viking military glory and Viking suffering in terms that served Norse cultural purposes. They describe the great battles. They describe heroic deaths. They do not describe, with any detail, what happened to the women of settlements that fell between these two silences. The Anglo-Saxon silence about what their forces did, and the Norse silence about what was done to their women. There is a gap in the historical record that has persisted for over 1,000 years. But the gap is not empty. It is filled with evidence that neither side chose to write down, but that neither side could entirely prevent from being recorded. Legal documents, church records, archaeological evidence, the testimony embedded in compensation codes and property transfer documents, and ecclesiastical correspondence about pastoral problems that the church had not previously encountered. That evidence tells a story, and that story is what nobody has put together for you. Until tonight, comment below right now. Tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I am about to take you through documents that have been sitting in archives for 1,000 years, and I want to know who is in the room with me for this. Part 5. The system. Let me give you the structure before I give you the details, because the details are brutal, and brutality without structure is just horror. What I am about to show you is not just horror. It is a system. An organized, legally supported, institutionally sustained system for processing captured women from Norse settlements that operated across Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia during the period of Anglo-Saxon Norse conflict from approximately 850 to 950. That system had 4 stages. The first stage was the selection. Not everyone in a raided settlement was taken. The decision about who was taken and who was not random. It followed criteria that the legal codes of the period illuminate with uncomfortable specificity. The second stage was the classification. Captured women were not all treated the same way. They were assigned to categories that determined their subsequent treatment, their destination, and their chances of ever returning to anything resembling their previous lives. The third stage was the processing. Each category had its own set of procedures that were specific, procedures that were documented, at least obliquely, in the sources that survive, procedures that captive women described, when they had the opportunity to describe anything, in terms that the Anglo-Saxon Church found theologically inconvenient and administratively challenging. The fourth stage was the consequence. What happened after the processing? The long aftermath. The part that lasted not days but years, decades in some cases. The part that the legal documents preserve most clearly because it was the part that generated disputes that needed legal resolution. I am going to walk you through all 4 stages. But I want you to hold on to something before we start, because this is important. The women who went through this system were not passive. They were not simply acted upon. They made decisions. They calculated. They found means of survival and occasionally of resistance within a structure that had been designed to give them no options. We know this because some of them came back. Some of them returned to Norse communities, either through ransom or through the eventual territorial settlements that ended some of the conflict. And when they came back, some of them told their stories to people who wrote those stories down, in fragments, in contexts that were not designed to preserve them, in ways that required considerable reconstruction to read. We can read them. Astrid Eiriksdottir is still on the floor of her longhouse. Her wrists are bound. She can hear her children but cannot see them. Let me tell you what the selection process looked like, what criteria determined who was taken and who was not, because understanding the selection is understanding everything that came after. Part 6. The selection. The Anglo-Saxon law codes of the 9th century are, if you read them with the right question in mind, extraordinarily revealing documents. The right question is not the one legal historians usually ask. Legal historians read these codes to understand the structure of Anglo-Saxon society, the nature of its legal institutions, the sophistication of its governance. Those are legitimate questions, and they produce legitimate scholarship. The question I am asking is different. I am asking, what do these codes tell us about what Anglo-Saxon warriors were permitted to do with captured Norse women? And what do they tell us about the criteria used to determine which women were captured in the first place? The answer is specific enough to be disturbing. The laws of Qin, which I mentioned earlier, establish a legal framework for captives taken in military operations that distinguishes clearly between different categories of captive. The distinction that matters for our purposes is between what the codes call Welchin, a term that literally means Welshkin, but that was applied broadly to anyone who was not Anglo-Saxon, including by the 9th century, the Norse settlers, and what the codes call Theowas, the unfree. A Welshkin woman taken in a military operation occupied a legally ambiguous category. She was not a slave by the definition the codes apply to English slaves, but she was not free by the definition the codes applied to English free women. She was in between, and the code's treatment of her in-between status tells us something important about what that status meant in practice. The compensation rates. This is where the codes become specific in ways that require careful attention. Anglo-Saxon law operated on a system of compensation. Harm done to a person generated a legal obligation to compensate, not the person harmed, in many cases, but the person who owned the harmed person. A woman's worgeld, her legal value, the compensation owed if she was killed or harmed, was set at specific levels depending on her status. A Norse woman captured in a raid had no worgeld in Anglo-Saxon law. She had no legal standing as a person. She was, in legal terms, property taken from an enemy, and the law had very specific things to say about what could be done with enemy property. The raiding parties that entered Norse settlements in Northumbria in the second half of the 9th century were not operating outside the law. They were operating within it. The selection criteria that determined which women were taken followed a logic embedded in this legal framework: women who were young enough to be useful. This term useful appears in contemporary church documents in contexts that make its meaning in this context specific. A woman who could perform labor, who could be assigned domestic tasks in an Anglo-Saxon household, who could be productive in the economic terms that mattered to the household that would receive her. Women who were healthy enough to survive transport. The journey from a raided Norse settlement to the Anglo-Saxon community that would receive the captives was not short and was not gentle. Captives who could not survive it were a logistical burden. The selection filtered for physical condition in ways that were ruthlessly practical. Women who were sufficiently prominent that their captivity carried additional value. A woman who was the wife or daughter of a Norse chieftain or trader had value beyond her labor. She was a statement about the outcome of the conflict, a visible evidence of Anglo-Saxon success that could be displayed, traded, or used as leverage in negotiations. Astrid Eiriksdottir was the wife of a Norse chieftain. She was 34 years old. She was healthy. She met all three criteria. Her children were a different calculation. Part 7. The children. I need to stop here, because this is the part of the story that the sources document and that everything in the human brain resists accepting. And I am going to ask you to stay with me through it, not because the subject matter is comfortable, but because turning away from it is exactly how this history has stayed hidden for 1,000 years. The fate of children in raided Norse settlements followed different criteria than the fate of adult women. The Anglo-Saxon legal codes, the church records, and the limited archaeological evidence from settlement sites that have been excavated all point toward a consistent pattern. Children below a certain age, assessed practically rather than by stated age, were not typically taken in raids. This was not mercy, it was economics. A young child required resources to transport and to maintain, could not perform useful labor for years, and had a high mortality rate under the conditions of forced transport. A young child was not, in the ruthlessly practical calculation of the raid, worth taking. What happened to the children who were not taken depended on what happened to the community they were left in. If the community survived the raid as a functioning settlement, if the Anglo-Saxon raiders were consolidating control rather than eliminating the settlement, the children might remain. Under what conditions, and with whose supervision, and with what futures available to them, is a question the sources answer obliquely and archaeologists are still working through. If the community did not survive, if the raid was elimination rather than consolidation, the children did not survive it either. Astrid could hear her children. She could tell from the sounds they were making that they were frightened, that they were restrained, that they were being assessed. She could not tell which calculation was being made. She would not know for 3 days. I am going to tell you what she found out, but first I need to explain the second stage of the system, the classification. Because what happened to her children depended entirely on which category Astrid herself was assigned to, and I need you to understand what those categories were. Part 8. The classification here is something that the standard histories of the Viking Age almost never tell you. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the 9th century had a sophisticated, legally codified system for integrating captured women into their social structure. Not a chaotic, ad hoc response to military success, a system with categories, with rules, with procedures that were specific enough to generate legal disputes that needed resolution, and specific enough that the resolutions of those disputes were recorded. We have those records. The categories into which captured Norse women were classified determined everything: their physical treatment, their destination, the nature of their captivity, their chances of ever returning to their previous lives, and the legal status of any children they subsequently had. The first category was household integration. A captured woman assessed as having particular domestic value, skill in textile work, knowledge of food preparation, capacity for childcare, or the kind of general domestic competence that ran a household in the 9th century might be integrated into an Anglo-Saxon household as an unfree domestic worker. The legal status of this position was specific. She was not quite a slave in the terms the codes applied to English-born slaves, but she was not free. She could not leave. She could not refuse labor. She could not marry without the permission of the household head. She could not hold property. The church had views about this category. Those views were complicated and inconsistent in ways that tell us a great deal about how common the practice was and how uncomfortable it made ecclesiastical authorities. The second category was transfer. A captured woman assessed as having value beyond the specific needs of the raiding party might be transferred, traded, essentially, though the codes used different language to another party. This transfer was a legal transaction, documented, with compensation flowing between the parties. The documentation of these transfers is one of the most specific sources we have for understanding the scale of the practice. The third category was ransom. A captured woman of sufficient prominence, prominent enough that someone in the Norse community might pay to get her back, might be held for ransom rather than immediately integrated or transferred. This category had its own procedures, its own timelines, its own conditions of captivity during the waiting period. The fourth category is the one that neither the Anglo-Saxon chronicles nor the Norse sagas describe directly. It is the category that required the most careful reconstruction from oblique sources. It is the category that tells us the most about what the conflict between Anglo-Saxon and Norse peoples actually looked like for the people caught inside it. The church records call it by a variety of terms that all describe the same thing: unlawful cohabitation, concubinage, irregular union. The ecclesiastical problem of men who had Anglo-Saxon wives and Norse captive women in the same household, and who saw no contradiction between these arrangements because the legal framework of their society did not define it as a contradiction. The documents that address this problem are among the most revealing sources for this period, not because they describe what happened to captured women with directness. They do not. The church was not in the business of describing things directly when indirectness was available, but because the pastoral problems they describe are only comprehensible if you understand what generated them. Astrid Eriksdotter was classified before she reached the place she would spend the next 4 years of her life. She was classified in the first hour, in the flickering torchlight of her own Lawton house, by a man whose name she did not know and whose language she barely spoke, who looked at her the way a livestock assessor looks at cattle. She was classified as ransom. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what it meant to be classified as ransom in a system that held you for potential value without any guarantee that the value would ever be paid? Let me explain it precisely. Part 9. What ransom meant. Being classified as ransom was not being classified as safe. This is the misunderstanding that the source is correct with a patience that comes from the sheer number of times they have to address the consequences. A woman held for ransom was held in a condition of captivity that lasted as long as the ransom negotiation lasted, which could mean weeks, could mean months. In some documented cases, could mean years, because the Norse community from which she had been taken might have been destroyed or displaced, because the person responsible for paying her ransom might not have the resources, because the negotiation itself took time in a world where communication moved at the speed of a horse, and the parties negotiating were also engaged in active military conflict. During that time, during the weeks or months or years of waiting, a ransom captive existed in a legal condition that the codes did not define, with the specificity they applied to other categories, and in the gap of that definition, things happened. The church documents that describe the pastoral problems generated by Norse captive women in Anglo-Saxon households address, with considerable circumspection, the question of what constituted harm to a ransom captive that would need to be addressed in any eventual settlement. They addressed this question because it had been raised in actual cases, because actual ransom negotiations had encountered actual disputes about what had happened to the woman during the waiting period. The documents do not describe what happened. They described the disputes about what had happened. They described the legal questions those disputes raised. They described the ecclesiastical positions taken on those questions, and the inconsistencies between different ecclesiastical authorities' positions. Reading these documents is an exercise in reading what is not being said in order to understand what was. It requires patience. It requires familiarity with the conventions of ecclesiastical Latin of the period. It requires an understanding of what kinds of things generated legal disputes in 9th century Northumbria. It requires, most of all, the willingness to follow the evidence where it goes rather than where it is more comfortable to stop. I have followed it. Here's what it says. Part 10. The women who described The historical record for this period is not only institutional. It is not only legal codes and church documents and archaeological sites. It also contains fragmentary and difficult to access the testimony of women who experienced Anglo-Saxon captivity and who subsequently had the opportunity to describe what they had experienced. These testimonies survive in several different forms. The most direct form is the captivity narrative accounts that were written down or dictated by Norse women who had been captured and subsequently returned to Norse communities or Norse-influenced communities in the Danelaw. These accounts were recorded because they were legally relevant. They documented what had happened to the woman, which affected her legal status, which affected property and inheritance questions that Norse law needed to resolve. The Norse legal tradition, unlike the Anglo-Saxon tradition, recognized a specific category for women who had experienced captivity. The category had a name, it had legal consequences, and it required testimony about the captivity experience in order to apply. That testimony filtered through legal proceedings, preserved in fragments of Norse legal records that have survived the centuries, is the most direct evidence we have for what Norse women said about what happened to them. The historian Eleanor Rosamund Barrett-Crowe, whose work on Norse women and identity is among the most careful scholarship in the field, describes these captivity testimonies as documents that have been categorized, filed, largely unread by generations of legal historians who were looking for something other than what they contain. She is correct. They have been largely unread for the purposes we need them. Read for what they tell us about Norse legal procedure. They are routine documents. Read for what they tell us about what Norse women said happened to them in Anglo-Saxon captivity. They are something else entirely. The testimonies cluster around certain experiences with a consistency that historians treat as evidence of systematic rather than individual practice. The first cluster is about the transit, the journey from the raided settlement to the destination. Every testimony that describes this journey describes it in terms of speed, physical demand, and systematic deprivation. The women were moved quickly. They were not given time to rest. They were not given adequate food or water. They were kept restrained at night. The journey was itself a processing mechanism, filtering out the physically weak and establishing the hierarchy of authority that would govern the captive's life at the destination. The second cluster is about the first weeks at the destination. The testimonies describe a period of extreme disorientation. Different language, different food, different physical environment, different domestic arrangements. Everything familiar removed simultaneously. The testimonies describe this period not as an accident of circumstance but as something that felt deliberate, as if the complete unfamiliarity of everything was a technique rather than a consequence. They were right. It was a technique. The church documents that address the pastoral problems of Norse captives in Anglo-Saxon households describe, in the context of addressing something else entirely, a recognized approach to the management of captive women in the initial period that had the effect the testimonies describe. It was not codified as a deliberate identity dissolution technique, but it operated as one. The third cluster is about what the testimonies describe only obliquely, in the legal language of harm and damage that the Norse legal proceedings required them to document. I am going to tell you what that language meant, but first I need to tell you about the women who never came back to give any testimony at all, because they are part of this story too. They are the majority of this story. Part 11. The ones who didn't come back. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what I am about to tell you is the part of this history that requires the most reconstruction and the most care, and I need to know that you are going to stay with me to the end of it. Comment below. Tell me what you know about the Viking Age and what you thought you knew before tonight. I want to understand what this is changing for you. The women who never returned from Anglo-Saxon captivity are documented differently than the women who did. They are documented in their absence, in the Norse community records that show household composition before and after a raid, in the inheritance documents that process the estates of women who disappeared and were not ransomed and did not return, in the names that stop appearing in community records after a specific date. Archaeologically, they appear in ways that are still being processed by researchers who are relatively new to asking this specific question. The cemetery evidence from Anglo-Saxon sites in the former Danelok region, reanalyzed in recent decades using isotope analysis that can identify geographic origin from skeletal remains, contains individuals who were born in Scandinavia and died in Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia during the period of Anglo-Saxon-Norse conflict. Some of these individuals have burial contexts consistent with their status as free members of Anglo-Saxon communities. Some have burial contexts that do not. The distinction matters. Burial in an Anglo-Saxon cemetery, with appropriate grave goods, in a position consistent with Christian burial practice, indicates a degree of integration into Anglo-Saxon society, voluntary or otherwise, that has specific implications for understanding what happened to the woman during her lifetime in that society. Burial without those markers indicates something different. The isotope analysis that can establish Scandinavian origin combined with the burial context analysis that can suggest social status is producing a dataset that was not available to historians 20 years ago. That dataset is telling a story about Norse women in Anglo-Saxon territory that the written sources told only in fragments. The women who didn't come back are visible in this data. Not as individuals, their names are gone. Their testimonies were never recorded, their experiences were never preserved in any form that carries their perspective, but they are visible as a population, as a pattern, as evidence of something systematic that operated at scale, over decades, across a territory large enough to generate the archaeological signature that isotope analysis is now beginning to map. They were there, we can see they were there, we cannot hear them, but we can see that they were there. That matters. Part 12. What Astrid found out on the third day. Astrid learned what had happened to her children. She learned it not from the people who held her. She did not yet have enough of their language to understand direct communication, but from a woman who had been in this household for 2 years before Astrid arrived, a woman from a Norse settlement further north that had been raided in 864, a woman who had been classified as household integration rather than ransom, which meant she had been here long enough to learn the language, long enough to understand the household structure, long enough to serve as the bridge between the new captive and the people who held her. This woman's name was Sigrid. She appears in the Norse legal records from a period a decade later, when the territorial settlements that ended some of the conflict created conditions under which some captive women were released. She appears in those records with a testimony that is one of the most specific we have. She told Astrid what had been done with the children. The older two, 12 and 9, had been taken. They were old enough to perform labor, young enough to be transformed, healthy enough to survive transport. They had been classified and sent to a different destination than their mother. The classification of children was separate from the classification of their mothers, because their utility was assessed differently, and because separating them from their mothers was itself part of the process. The youngest, 4 years old, had not been taken. I am not going to describe what Astrid did when she learned this. The Norse legal record describes her subsequent behavior in the household over the following months in terms that are precise about what she did and what happened to her as a result of doing it. I am going to tell you about that behavior, because it is the part of this history that the standard accounts leave out entirely, the part about what the women themselves did inside the system. But I want you to sit with what I have just told you for a moment. A woman, a longhouse, 3 children, 4 minutes, and then years. This is not an exceptional story. This is a documented pattern. This happened to hundreds of women across a period of decades, in a territory large enough to encompass modern Yorkshire and Lincolnshire and Norfolk, in a conflict that the textbooks describe as the Viking Age without describing this. Now let me tell you about the resistance. Part 13. The resistance. The Norse legal tradition preserved something that the Anglo-Saxon tradition had no framework to accommodate. It preserved testimony about what captured women did. not what was done to them, what they did. The distinction is not cosmetic. The standard historical account of captive women in any conflict tends to position them as entirely passive, as people to whom things happened, not as people who made decisions, took actions, created consequences. The sources for this period are more complicated than that account allows. Sigrid, in the testimony she gave when she was released, describes a taxonomy of resistance that she observed and participated in over 2 years in an Anglo-Saxon household. A taxonomy that she describes as understood among the captive women she knew as something they discussed, analyzed, and strategized about in the limited spaces where they could communicate with each other. The first category of resistance was what Sigrid calls invisible knowledge, the deliberate maintenance, in secret, of Norse language, Norse religious practice, Norse domestic custom, Norse memory, the practice of keeping alive, in the interior of the self, everything that the captivity process was designed to dissolve. This was not passive survival. It was active maintenance. It required effort. It required the creation of interior spaces, mental, emotional, relational, that the household could not reach. The second category was what the records describe, from the household's perspective, as intractability, difficulty, resistance to instruction. From the captive women's perspective, as Sigrid describes it, it was strategic non-compliance, a calculation about which demands could be resisted without generating consequences that made things worse, and which had to be complied with to avoid those consequences. This calculation was ongoing, exhausting, and never fully resolvable. Every day required new calculations. Every interaction required assessment of what was safe to resist and what was not. The third category is the one that the Anglo-Saxon church documents addressed most frequently, because it generated the pastoral problems that required ecclesiastical intervention. It was communication, the maintenance of connection between captive women in the same household, between captive women in different households who found ways to pass information, between captive women in the Norse communities from which they had been taken. This communication was technically impossible by the conditions of their captivity. It happened anyway. It happened through the trade networks that connected Anglo-Saxon communities, through the movement of goods that required the movement of people, through the small moments of unobserved contact that exist in any social environment, regardless of how tightly it is controlled. It happened because the women created it, deliberately, strategically, at risk to themselves. Some of those communications were intercepted. The consequences of interception are documented in the same legal records that document the household integration conditions. They are not mild. Some were not intercepted, and some of those that were not intercepted carried information that eventually contributed to ransom negotiations, that eventually reached Norse communities with enough detail about the captive's location and condition to make recovery possible. Astrid Eiriksdottir maintained her Norse identity for 4 years in an Anglo-Saxon household. She learned their language well enough to understand everything said around her and to respond minimally when required. She retained her Norse language with the deliberateness of someone who knew that forgetting it would mean losing something she could not afford to lose. She identified, within the first 3 months, 2 other Norse women in the same household's network and found ways to communicate with them. She did not escape. Escape was not possible in a geographic and social environment that offered nowhere to go. But she maintained herself. She maintained her identity. She maintained her knowledge of who she was and where she came from and what had happened and what she wanted to happen. She was ransomed in the autumn of 874 years, 1 month, and 11 days after the night her longhouse fire went out. Part 14. The return. She came back to a community that was not the community she had left. The settlement had been rebuilt, partially, by a different combination of Norse settlers than had been there before. Some of the people she had known were dead, some had fled, some had been taken in subsequent raids. The house was different. The people were different. The landscape looked the same sea, the same clay soil, the same particular quality of North Sea light in autumn, but everything that had made the landscape familiar had been altered, and she was different. This is the part of captivity history that the sources document with surprising specificity, because the return of a captive woman generated legal questions that required documentation. Norse law had a specific framework for the reintegration of women who returned from captivity. The framework was not straightforward. It involved questions about the woman's legal status during her captivity, questions about what had happened and what the legal consequences of what had happened were for her standing in the community, for property she had held, for relationships she had held. The framework was not designed to punish women for what had been done to them, but it required them to describe what had been done to them, in legal terms, in proceedings that determined their status. And the description, the legal process of naming and categorizing experience, was itself a form of violence, that the sources do not acknowledge as such but that the testimonies reveal as deeply damaging to the women who went through it. Astrid gave her testimony. The Norse legal record that preserves fragments of it describes a woman who spoke with precision about what she had experienced, not with emotion, with precision, as if she had rehearsed the account so many times, in the privacy of her own mind, during 4 years of captivity, that it had become something she could produce on demand without it touching her. The record does not tell us what it cost her to do that. The record tells us what the legal proceeding determined, which was that she was restored to free status, that her property was returned, that her surviving children, the 2 who had been taken and whom she had not yet found, remained legally her children and subject to her parental rights under Norse law if they were ever recovered. She spent the next 11 years trying to recover them. We do not know if she succeeded. The records that might tell us that stop, as records do, without explanation. The name stops appearing. The case stops being mentioned. She is last documented in 881 in a brief reference in a settlement agreement between a Norse chieftain and an Anglo-Saxon lord, as a witness to a land transfer. She is described as a free woman. She is identified by her own name and her father's name. She is not described by her husband's name, because he died on the wall 11 years earlier. She signed as herself. That is the last thing the record gives us. Part 15. What the sources tell us and why we weren't taught. Let me bring this back to the question I want to leave you with. The sources for this history have existed for over 1,000 years. The legal codes are in published editions with English translations. The church documents have been in ecclesiastical archives, catalogued and available, for centuries. The Norse legal records are available in Icelandic and in translation. The isotope analysis data is being published in peer-reviewed journals. None of this is hidden. None of this required secret access or recent discovery. So why don't most people know it? The answer has several parts and all of them are uncomfortable. The first part is about whose history gets told. The history of the Viking Age has been told primarily through the lens of the people who left the most dramatic written record, the Anglo-Saxon church chroniclers and the Norse saga composers. Both of those groups had reasons to tell certain stories and strong reasons to avoid others. The experiences of Norse women in Anglo-Saxon captivity served neither narrative. It was not a story that celebrated Christian victory or Norse heroism. It was a story that complicated both. The second part is about what the Academy has historically considered important: military history, political history, the history of institutions and states and rulers. The history of what happened to women in the aftermath of conflict was not considered a separate field worth studying until relatively recently. The evidence was in the sources. The questions that would have unlocked it were not being asked. The third part is about us, about what we want history to be. We want the Viking Age to be longships and runes and warrior culture and the occasional appearance of a shield maiden who proves that women could be exceptional. We do not want it to be the documented, systematic, legally supported experience of Norse women in Anglo-Saxon captivity. We do not want history to be as complicated and as dark as the evidence shows it to be. But the evidence shows what it shows. And the women whose experiences it documents deserve to have those experiences described accurately. Astrid Eriksdottir was not a footnote to the Viking Age. She was not background context for the military campaigns that the history books describe. She was a person who experienced what the conflict of her period actually looked like for the people who lived through it. Her name is in the sources. She was there. And now you know. If you watched this to the end, I want to ask you something. What did you know about the Viking Age before this video? And what is different now? Comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what you want to understand next. The history that has been left out of the standard account is not a small gap. It is the majority of what actually happened. Hit subscribe if you want to keep going. Because Astrid was not the only one. And her story is not the only one waiting in the archives. The sources are there. The evidence is there. I am going to keep reading it and telling you what it says. That is the promise.